So in the last video we took a look at Wolfenstein 3D and its sequel, Spear of Destiny. Not a classic in the same vein as Doom or Quake, but still a decent enough shooter overall. It wasn't until 2001 when we would see the franchise revisited, when Grey Matter Interactive would develop Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Grey Matter are the same guys who created Redneck Rampage and Kingpin, two games with some truly buggy and glitchy shooting mechanics. Return to Castle Wolfenstein, however, didn't suffer from these problems nearly as much, and on the whole is an awesome, brutally difficult game that's one of the best of the old school shooters. Not to mention it had one of the single greatest multiplayer modes of any game at the time. It brought back the key themes from Wolfenstein 3D, being primarily shooting, obviously, and treasure hunting, as well as giving the game much more of a focus on the paranormal. This is a combination that would later be followed on with the release of Wolfenstein in 2009, developed by Raven Software, running on the Doom 3 engine and released for Microsoft Windows and the consoles expectedly. BJ returns once again to continue his fight against the Nazis. In a weird contrast, he's quite vocal during the cutscenes, even showing off something akin to an actual personality, though during gameplay he's all but completely silent. Instead of moving through the story mode in a linear fashion, you're now dropped into a large city called Isenstadt, which serves as a hub for the game's missions. In between missions you can explore the city for gold and intel, which are used to upgrade weapons and skills. Or you can just run around and get into skirmishes with patrolling Nazi troops. Exploring Isenstadt is great fun, and there's lots of little alleyways and hidden routes to take whether you want to ambush enemies or avoid them outright. It's also great watching how the amount of Nazis in the city slowly increases as the game's story progresses, as your character makes more of a name for himself around town. Early on in the game, BJ acquires something called the Thor Medallion, which gives him access to something called the Veil, as well as the ability to use various powers, defensive and offensive, in combat. The energy for these abilities are replenished by something called Dark Sun energy pools, which are found in abundance throughout the environment. These abilities include Empower, which increases your weapon damage, Shield, which, well, shields you, and something called Mire, which is like a bullet time effect that slows time to the extent that you can dodge bullets themselves. But the main power you'll be using is just the Veil itself. The Veil is kind of like an alternate reality that exists in the same time frame, but looks different visually. Whenever BJ is in the Veil, he can move faster, enemies are highlighted in the environment, and he can even move through solid matter at certain areas. I don't have an issue with this for the most part, but it does beg the question as to why you wouldn't want to be in the Veil all the time. The art style does look a lot uglier when you're in the Veil, as it's obviously trying to make the Veil reality appear a lot more menacing and demonic, but the positives really outweigh the negatives here. I am happy to say that Raven Software have also done a great job of making each story mission different from the last. You'll explore an ancient crypt, a Nazi lab, and even an oversized blimp for the game's finale that feels like something out of a James Bond film. You even set foot in Castle Wolfenstein later in the game. The Doom 3 engine does a pretty good job of rendering all of these areas with some detailed textures here and there. It's not amazing, but it gets the job done. Aside from the main story mode, there's also a series of smaller side missions to be completed. These don't have any effect on the game overall, but are just fun little distractions to give the game a bit more length. As mentioned earlier, you collect gold throughout the game to upgrade your weapons and skills. Weapons can be upgraded to do more damage, hold more ammo, or just simple things like increasing their overall accuracy. There isn't enough gold to upgrade everything, so you have to be a little bit selective. Wolfenstein fans will no doubt love seeing the return of weapons like the Tesla gun and the flamethrower, along with new additions like the MP43, which replaces the FG42, and other fictional guns like the particle cannon, and something called the Leichenfaust. This is a black sun energy weapon that basically vaporizes everything it comes into contact with, and it is as awesome as that sounds. When these weapons are upgraded, they become absolutely brutal, able to kill standard enemies in a single hit. But it's BJ's powers with the Thor Medallion that affect things the most. Upgrading the medallion allows your skills to become downright godly. Mire will practically bring time to a standstill, allowing you to run right past large groups of soldiers and gun them down instantly. While your shield can be upgraded to bounce bullets right back at your attackers and even vaporize enemies unlucky enough to come too close to you. There are some tough enemies that you have to fight throughout the game, and it can be really satisfying when you manage to use all your powers and take them down. And what would a Wolfenstein game be without those crazy-ass leather-clad Nazi babes, huh? Overall, the combat is great fun. I wish I could say the same thing about the boss fights, but that would make me a liar. Because the boss fights are shit. Really shit. Like, let's just throw in these bosses as an afterthought and make them as artificially difficult as possible shit. They're by far one of the worst elements of the entire game, and I can't even imagine how you could defeat some of these guys on the higher difficulties, as their damage output is extremely unbalanced. Another issue is that there's a real difficulty spike for the last few levels, and the game becomes a hell of a lot harder. I guess they thought that because they'd given you superpowers, it would be alright to throw dozens of enemies at you, and while that's true to an extent, it does seem a little bit unfair at times. It affects the gameplay out of missions as well, and you can't walk down the street without literally having to fight platoons of soldiers at a time. It's not a good way to round things up. In terms of a sequel, Wolfenstein has really progressed the series. Raven Software have really tried to develop the story, gameplay, and characters, and you can see that from the amount of stuff they've added into the game. I'd take Return to Castle Wolfenstein over this any day of the week though, but that's mainly just because I'm a nostalgia fag who's still living in 2001. But in all honesty, I'd easily recommend this game to anyone familiar with modern shooters that wants something with a different spin on what has truly become a tired formula. Get psyched.